Once the second layer of silicone has been allowed to set up, we can start the next step, which is going to be making the silicone wall. The silicone wall serves a couple of purposes in this instance. For one, it's going to be the border around the edge of our silicone skin. So along the entire back edge of the silicone skin where the mask ends, we're going to have a silicone wall that will end up being square, and this will allow for good registration with the model mold and keep the silicone from flopping around. Because thicker silicone along the edge makes the edge stiffer, so that it stays in place a little bit better. In addition to that, we're going to build a silicone wall leading from the back edge where the mask ends, along the top of the head, towards the spot where we've embedded the wooden dowel into our silicone. This part of the silicone wall is going to be where we will make our release cut. Since we're not making a regular two-part mold but a mask, this cut will only serve to make it a bit easier to pry the silicone off the eventually cast mask. If you've never been down this road before, it's going to be a bit tricky to imagine how this is going to work, but you'll see it soon enough if you stick with this series. It will all make sense in the end if it doesn't make sense already. We're using the same silicone here, but it's a different catalyzer. The catalyzer is a faster setting one, and this is indicated by the fact that the color of it is pink. The faster setting just speeds up what we're able to do here, and we can do more work and add more silicone without having as much of an issue with drooping and sagging, and we can work faster. I only use the pink catalyzer for the walls because it's not that good at capturing details, and it shrinks a bit more than the yellow catalyzer does. This can cause many issues, but we'll discuss those and how to solve them later in the video in some of the last steps that we'll take in making this wall. The mixing procedure is the same, though I'm not sure about the ratio here. I go by color, and usually what I do is I will mix a little test first to see how it reacts. I do this because I've had some inconsistencies with this kind of catalyzer before, so I'm very cautious when using it. Always do a small test to make sure that the result you get is what you're after, that the silicone sets up, becomes hard in a decent amount of time, it doesn't become hard too fast. Usually with this type of catalyzer, we should be seeing around 10 to 15 minutes working time before it gets pretty firm, and it should be fairly firm in 30 minutes. Once you've made a test that works, you can mix to that same color, simply matching the mixtures visually. Obviously there will be some difference when doing this, but you will be able to make them close enough if you pay attention. Even though the pink silicone sets faster, we still can't add too much at once without encountering issues with the silicone sagging, so I use a 3-step process to build the walls. The first step is to make a triangle where I want my wall to be. This triangle is going to match the overall height that I'm after, and it's also going to match the overall width that I'm after. The overall height and width that I'm after is around the width and height of an adult, male adult thumb, that's of regular size. So that's a couple of centimeters wide, a couple of centimeters tall. A bigger mold will usually have a slightly bigger wall. This triangle is going to be able to support its own weight with little trouble, and therefore it's not going to sag and will stay in place. And the fact that it doesn't sag also helps it set up at the advertised speed. I pinch the material and press it down onto the surface of the silicone. This makes sure that the silicone sticks well and there are no air bubbles. I do actually use quite a bit of force here to accomplish the goal. Try to aim the top of the triangle in the direction you eventually want the flat top of the square wall to be located. This is going to help later down the line. If the wall is not perfectly placed, you can always tweak it slightly in the later stages, so it's not the end of the world. I add a little extra silicone around the wooden dowel as well. You can sort of imagine the wall traveling around the wooden dowel in a way, or the wooden dowel being sort of embedded inside the wall. The wall travels down the place where I intend to cut the silicone open to help release the cast inside of it easier. With a mask mold, this is not always required, meaning a Mohawk cut that is, but here I think it's going to help a lot in getting casts out. I have had instances where I brought a mask mold without a Mohawk cut to a foundry and they made a Mohawk cut on my mold to make sure the casting would come out undamaged. But of course, because I didn't make a Mohawk cut myself in the silicone, there was no wall, there was no dowel. This meant that when the foundry made this cut, they essentially damaged my mold, though I did say yes to doing it to make sure they could get the cast out. And now, the mold is very hard to put back together accurately, and it is slowly tearing further and further down the forehead every time I cast in it. This kind of Mohawk mask mold is something that I came up with to prevent issues such as this. The second step to the silicone wall making process takes place right after the first step is set up. This is usually not going to take too long as we're using pink catalyzer. Depending on the size of your mold, it's usually ready to go where you started by the time the first step is finished. And as I said, no longer than 30 minutes. This is great and saves us a ton of time compared to if we were using yellow catalyzer. Nothing is worse than having to sit around waiting for silicone to set up for hours on end. The second step is going to be to reinforce the size of the wall with more pinkly catalyzed silicone. The wall was a triangle and now we're going to make it into a square. Some might argue you can go straight for the square, but for the sake of control and making a nice looking mold, I like to start off with a triangle and then reinforce it by turning it into a square. This step is mostly about mass, but the same thing about application continues to apply here. You need to apply your silicone with a bit of force and make sure that the layers are somewhat blended together. While at the same time, you really need to make sure that you maintain a decently sharp angle between the silicone skin itself and the wall, about 90 degrees, or what I usually like to call an organic 90 degrees, is needed here in order for the piece to register snugly with the model mold, as if there's sort of this soft ramp and not a 90-degree corner, the silicone and model mold won't register and they will sort of just slide around. I keep the same height established as before, unless I missed a bit of the height with the triangle in some places, and more or less the same width, though it usually grows a little bit. The places to add silicone is in between the width and height to fill in the triangle and turn it into a square. This is going to take up the majority of the space that the wall will eventually take up. In order to make the final step a smooth ride, I do try to make sure that this step is not too much of a mess and that I do work rather clean. Usually anyone can accomplish this by simply knowing of it and making sure it occurs, versus forgetting about it and then working fast and sloppily. The final layers will be trying to smooth the surface of the wall out, and the smoother it is now, the faster that step will go, of course.